Alright, in this lecture we'll start off by checking out some of the user preferences. So let's go up into the Edit menu and go down to Preferences. Now I won't be going over every option in this lecture. I'm going to give you a brief explanation of what's in each tab and then suggest certain changes that could help your workflow. And you don't have to make those changes, but there are some benefits that I'll explain. Now the first thing I want to point out is the menu down here for saving preferences. Now by default it's set to auto save preferences, meaning if you change anything here, it gets automatically saved to Blender's default file. If you don't want that to be turned on and you just want to change things for the current project, make sure to disable this option at the bottom. And you can also manually save preferences here. You can revert to your last saved preferences. And if you want, you can load the factory preferences, which is going to just restore all the default values for everything you've changed. Alright, so let's get started going through the different tabs. So the interface tab up here is all about the elements of the layout. And most of this stuff, if not all of it, is more about how Blender looks. For example, the resolution scale here will change the scale of the text and fields and stuff like that. And you can turn off splash screen and tooltips. And if you don't like the idea of the toolbar over here kind of floating on the background, as well as the header up here, you can turn off region overlap, and it gives you a solid background, which is more of a classic look that you might like better. And one thing I like to turn off is the navigation controls, which you can see them up here. And these are just buttons you can use to zoom, to pan the view, to switch the camera view, and toggle between perspective and orthographic view. And I use the hotkeys for those things, so I usually turn that off. And down here we have some language translation options, some text rendering options like turning off anti-aliasing if you like that older, sharper style of text better. And then we have menu options down here, including pie menu options, and I want to change something in this menu. So right now you can see that animation timeout is set to 6, which means if we open up a pie menu, like if I press the hotkey for the pivot point menu, you can see that it takes a fraction of a second to actually open up. It animates the pie menu opening. So it takes a fraction of a second longer for you to actually see the options. So what I like to do is change animation timeout down to 0 so that the pie menu opening will be instantaneous. Just makes things slightly faster and just makes workflow feel faster. So that's a change that I would suggest making. Alright, let's head over to the Themes tab now, and this is all about colors and style of the interface. You can change the color for pretty much everything in the software using these options here. So you can spend a fair amount of time customizing Blender to look exactly the way you want it to. And besides color and style, there's some other options as well. For example, if we went into the 3D view options and we scroll down a bit, you can see we have some more functional options down here like vertex size. So for example, if we went into edit mode and these vertices are a little bit too small for our liking, we can just increase the vertex size to however big we want it to be. I'll keep that set to 3 though, it's a good size. Let's move on down to viewport options now, and we have some display options here. So we have some basic display stuff up here like object info, which is showing us the object name that we have selected right there. And we have the name of the view being displayed right above it. And we have the gizmo options here if you use that. And down here we have some anti-aliasing options if you want to change how the lines are drawn in the viewport. And then we also have some texture quality options for how textures are displayed in the viewport. Now let's move down to lights, and in this tab we can customize all the preview lighting and preview environments for the 3D view. For example, we can edit the studio lights by dropping down that menu here, and now we have access to the different studio lights or the default lighting in the scene that we can see bouncing off the cube right now. So for example, I could drag this over so I can see the cube better and click on Edit Studio Light, and now we can edit that default lighting. We can change the direction of the light down here just by clicking and dragging. And you can see how it updates the light. And there's all these other options as well. I'm going to click on that to kind of cancel it and get back our default lighting. Now there's also options down here to load in your custom matte caps and custom HDRIs, and we're going to be covering these things in future lectures. Now the editing and animation tabs right here are more specific to working with objects in different ways and in different modes. We're not going to be changing anything in these tabs right now. We're going to stick more to interface, navigation, and technical stuff in this lecture. But we might be making some changes in these tabs throughout the course if needed. Now let's go down to the add-ons tab. Blender actually has tons of awesome add-ons. In the future we'll be adding an overview of different add-ons to the course, but for now I'll just suggest enabling one add-on called the Node Wrangler. And we can find that by simply going to the search field, typing in Node, and there we go, it pops up. So it's right here called the Node Wrangler, and this add-on helps speed up workflow in node editors, so it's very important to enable. So let's just click on that checkbox right there, and that's all. Now let's head on down to the Input tab here, and this tab has options for input devices like keyboard, mouse, tablet, or even 3D mouse options down here. And a couple of important options to look out for is this one here called Emulate Numpad. If you don't have a numpad on your keyboard, you can enable this and it will use the number row as the numpad as well. And also Emulate 3-button mouse. If you only have 2 buttons on your mouse, you don't have a middle mouse button, you can enable this and it will act like holding Alt and left clicking is your middle mouse. Now let's head on down to the Navigation tab here, and this tab's an important one. I'm going to change a few things here. Now all of these options here are for navigating in 3D space, and to make things a little bit easier on ourselves, we're going to enable 2 things starting with auto depth. Now with auto depth turned off, you can see when I middle click and drag to rotate the scene, it's rotating around this invisible point in space in the middle. And if I want to move that pivot point for the rotation of the scene, I can hold shift and middle click and drag to pan the scene over here, and that pans that center point somewhere around there. So now if I middle click and drag to rotate, you can see it's rotating around some arbitrary point in space here that we can't see. And this can get real confusing real fast because you don't know where it is. So if I zoomed into the cube and now I want to rotate around the cube, I'll middle click and drag, but it's taking us away from it because that pivot point is somewhere out in space over there. So this can get real messy and real annoying real fast. So one way to fix this, you can either enable orbit around selection, which will rotate around whatever object you have selected, which is pretty cool. That works in edit mode as well. Or we can enable auto depth. And what this does is it takes any point in space that we click on, that we middle click on, and it uses that as the rotation point for the scene. So for example, let me zoom out. I'll duplicate the cube and move it over there. And let's move one over there too. So if I middle click over this surface here and drag, you can see the 3D scene is rotating around the point that I clicked on now. So wherever I middle click and drag, it becomes the rotation point for the 3D scene. And that is just super useful because now I can zoom in and I can work real close with something and not have to worry about that random pivot point in space and not knowing how the scene is going to rotate. Because wherever I click on is where it rotates around. So in my opinion, that is the best option to have enabled for rotating your scene. Now the next option I suggest enabling is zoom to mouse position. This makes it so wherever I have the mouse cursor, when I zoom in and out using the scroll wheel, it's going to zoom in and out based on where the cursor is. And that's just intuitive and that just makes sense to me, so I would suggest enabling that option. Now let's move down to the key map tab right here, and this tab is where you can customize all the hotkeys. And as you get more comfortable with Blender, you might find yourself back here switching some of these keys up. And there's actually another way to customize hotkeys as well. For example, I'm going to go into the window menu here, and I use the toggle window full screen option a lot, especially when I'm recording. So I want to give this a hotkey. So what we can do is right click on it, and it gives us the option to assign a hotkey. So I'll click on that, I'll hover over this field here, and let me press Alt F11. And you can see that becomes the hotkey. It's listed right next to it. So a lot of options in menus have this option if you simply right click, and you'll see change shortcut, remove shortcut, or assign shortcut. So that's a really cool way to customize the hotkeys if you can find those options in the menus. You just have to be careful that you don't overwrite any existing hotkeys. And let me go back to the user preferences. You can actually find out if a hotkey already exists for something by using this menu up here. Right now it's set to name, so we can search for the actual tool to see if it has a hotkey or not. But we can also switch this to key binding. And for example, I can type in Alt F11 and it'll show me any tools that use the Alt F11 hotkey. So in this example, only one, and that's the one we set. So I wouldn't be able to use this for anything else it would override this and this will become blank. So if you want to switch the hotkeys for something, just make sure the hotkey doesn't already exist for another tool. And now if you're really fond of your key mapping, if you put a lot of work into customizing it and it's absolutely perfect, you have the option to export your key configuration as well, and also import any configurations you might have already saved. Now let's move on down to the System tab here, which has some technical options like Cycles render devices at the top here. By default, Cycles will render using your CPU, but if you have a decent graphics card, you might want to enable GPU rendering instead for potentially faster render times. And to do that, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, then you can enable CUDA. And then make sure your GPU is enabled, which mine is by default. If you have a decent CPU as well, then you can also enable that. And Blender will use both the GPU and CPU together to render. I'm just going to keep mine set to GPU. And if you have an AMD graphics card instead, then you can switch over to OpenCL in that menu and choose your graphics card from there. Then down here we have options for memory and sound, and we might be changing up some of these options here throughout the course if needed. Now let's move to the Save and Load tab here, and here we've got some options for your blend files. Like for example, the Load UI option right here will load in the user interface saved in any blend file you open. But let's say you open up someone else's blend file and their layout is always a mess, and you'd rather load in their blend file using your default layout. Then you would want to disable that, but I'm going to keep that enabled. And there's other options here like for save versions and autosave, but we'll be getting more into this stuff in the saving and loading lecture. But we're not going to change anything in this tab right now, so let's move on to file paths. So this is where you can specify all the different folders to save to or load from. For example, if you have a folder that has all your textures that you use for projects, you can specify that folder path right here in the textures field so that when you go to open up new images, it'll automatically open this folder for browsing first. And if you want your renders saved to any default folder like your desktop, you can change that path right here. So I'm not going to change anything right now, but you might want to take a minute and specify some folder paths if you want to. So that pretty much does it for all the preferences. Now again, everything has been auto-saved by default since we have this option still enabled right here. So all the changes I made have been saved to my default Blender file. So that's going to do it for this lecture then, and I'll see you in the next one.